With no further ado, I'd like to introduce Angie Hong and talk a little bit about her. Angie Hong has been a conservation educator for more than 20 years. As coordinator for Minnesota's East Metro Water Education Program, she works with 30 local government partners to implement a wide array of educational programs focused on teaching and inspiring communities to protect water resources. Her tips and tales about keeping water clean are featured regularly in columns in the Stillwater Gazette, Forest Lake Times, and other local newspapers, as well as online at eastmetrowater.org. She also has a large following on Instagram and TikTok. If you've not followed her on there, it is MN Nature Awesomeness. Is that correct? So be sure you check that out as well. It's very fun, very entertaining, and we're delighted to have her here. So
wonderful. And it turns out this little dude, this is my son Charlie, who's no longer little. Now he's 12 and he is like towering over me, you know, like a good 3 inches taller than me, and he's in wrestling. So we'll see. We'll see if he shows up on Thursday, because yeah, he is into wrestling. I'm sorry that this is blinking in and out, but you know, hopefully it will just be fine. So like Emily said, I've been working in this area since 2006. So it's going on a little over 18 years in my job role. But for the first 5 years of my job, I was commuting from Savage to Stillwater, 80 miles round trip every year, or every day. 2011, I was finally able to move here to Stillwater after working in Stillwater for 5 years. It was like, oh, that's really where I want to be. And we moved here while I was pregnant with Charlie. So now a lot of my just my whole experience in Stillwater and getting to know the St. Croix River and this whole surrounding area just much more deeply. It's also, for me, really tied to my experience of being a parent and exploring with my son and just kind of growing through life and all those different stages of life. So when I set out to write this book, and I should back up and say, I had no intention of writing a book. So I had no intention of writing a book, but this was never on my to-do list for life. This, in fact, I never really intended on writing articles for the newspaper either. But when I started this job, somebody said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if you wrote a weekly article for the local papers that was maybe about water? And I was like, okay. I mean, it kind of sounds boring. Like, what would I think of to say week after week after week about water? But here I am, many, many years later, having somehow thought of something to say about water every week. And over the course of time, then people started suggesting, well, we really enjoy what you're writing. Maybe this would make itself into a book. But as I mentioned, I have a son and I work full time and I'm married and I'm juggling all the things of life. So it's like, well, that's a great idea for somebody else. But in the midst of COVID, as we got to 2022 and things were kind of clearing up in my life, I finally decided, here we go. I finally decided, okay, I'm going to do it. So I rented this VRBO in the middle of nowhere in Pine County, and I brought along all the necessary supplies, not intentionally color coordinated, but I think it does, it's like to carry me from the morning to the midday to the evening. And I brought my computer and the dog, and that was it. So I was like, no, nobody interrupting me, nobody asking me questions, nobody making demands, nobody talking to me. And I just kind of spent that week thinking about how I could piece together all of these pieces of, articles and information that I had compiled over time, all of my own personal experiences in the watershed, all of my professional experiences in the watershed. How does this come together as a book? And then during the daytime, because it was the middle of winter when I did this, I would go out exploring, So this was Banning State Park, where there's just these spectacular ice cliffs trailing down, and this was this just random curious little muskrat that I came across walking through the state forest up there. And so I got done with the week, and obviously it's not like I'd written a book in a week, but I had an outline and enough that I could get going and reach out to the University of Minnesota Press and say, hey, would you ever be interested in doing something like this? And should I keep going? Should I add more? I gave them my first draft at the end of October in 2022. And then it was not until July of this year that it finally was actually a book, because it turns out that it takes that long to publish a book. It takes that long for them to go through all the stages of reading and having early readers and editing and revising and compiling all the photos and laying it out and putting the captions in the right places and sending it off to the printer. And we finally got here. Da, 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 da! It's a book. So 2 years later, this July, the book came out. So that's a little of my story in the St. Croix, but I thought that I might start with a couple of props. And so my first prop to kind of go more like, what's the story of the St. Croix? Because I feel like this book, yes, it's a nature guide, but I also feel like it's the story of the St. Croix and who we are, the people who've lived here in the St. Croix, the places you can go, what makes the river special and unique, what makes the places surrounding it special and unique. So one of the things that is really important to the story of the St. Croix is this. And obviously it's water, but it's a special kind of water that came from deep underground. So part of the story of the St. Croix is that if we were all here 12,000 years ago, this entire area was, of course, covered in snow, deep, deep snow and ice. It was the middle of the Ice Age. And as those glacial waters retreated, it began to form all of these pockets of lakes and the wetlands and the tributaries that go to the St. Croix today. Now, the actual river that goes into the basalt rock, that had been there for millions and millions and millions of years. So the river itself is older than the Ice Age, but if you go up to the very, let's see if I can make my point longer. Oh, no, that didn't get me very far, did it? Maybe. Well, let's see. If we were to go up to the very top of the St. Croix watershed, this whole area that is shaded here is area that eventually drains to the St. Croix. And what I think is really interesting is you see it goes almost all the way up to Lake Superior. Okay. I was trying to point at this right here to the headwaters. So if you went up to right here, there is a huge wetland complex up around Solon Springs, Wisconsin. And this wetland complex was all formed by those glaciers as, yes, some of them melted and some of the water flowed away, but a lot of the water just sank into the ground. So today we have this huge wetland complex, and flowing out of it in one direction, there's this little short river called the Boise Brule, and it goes north up into Lake Superior. And then flowing south is this much, much, much longer river that becomes the St. Croix River and then connects with the Mississippi and goes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, which I just think is kind of interesting how it can be from this one, just kind of wetland complex. And if you go up there, there is actually an old footpath too that Native people and voyageurs used to use to travel through that area. So that is part of the story of the St. Croix, is that our geology today is really influenced by the glaciers. And that's why we have so many lakes in this area, so many pockets, so many wetlands, and why we have such plentiful groundwater, which feeds, our trout streams. And it is what is supplying the water for us to drink too, because it's 100% of the drinking water in Washington County. Okay, so that's part of the story of the St. Croix. My personal favorite stretch, because people do ask me this a lot, my personal favorite stretch, and I have one, absolutely, it is from the Log Cabin Landing up in Scandia down to William O'Brien State Park. And the reason that this is my favorite is, first of all, because it's close enough that I can get to it really easily. But second of all, because it's actually only about 2 miles. And what I have done for years, and especially when my son was younger, I would go up there with the stand-up paddleboard, and I would take him and the dog, and they would ride on the front of the paddleboard, and we would drop off a bike here at William O'Brien, and then we would go down the river. And even though it is a short jaunt, you can get into these backwater areas. And you can spend the whole day back there just kind of playing around and exploring. There's sandbars, there's birds, and there's usually not really any people. So we would just spend the whole day kind of lollygagging. And then when we get to the end, get on the bike at William O'Brien. It's just the short little ride back up to get to Log Cabin Landing and pick up the car. And it's a nice trail through William O'Brien and then onto a gravel road, so you don't ever have to ride your bike on the paved road. And then, you know, as Charlie got bigger, in the beginning, he was in the, you know, the little tow behind where he'd be on, you know, and now he rides his own bike. So, so that was always a fun and easy way to be able to do that without needing to have a shuttle service or have another adult come along with us. I mentioned that Charlie's getting bigger now. So despite the fact that we have gone in this stretch of the river, you know, from when he was this big to nowadays when he's this big, it somehow never gets old. Because rivers, you know, any of you who've been out there have probably seen it's constantly changing. You know, the channels change during high water versus low water. You have islands that appear and they disappear, and the animals you find back there are different. It just seems like every time we go out on the river, it's a new and fun adventure, and it doesn't really ever seem to get old. Okay, this gets me to prop number 2. Prop number 2 is part of the story of the St. Croix River. Huh. Any guesses? Any guesses? Okay, so if I wanted to plug this in, I would want to, you know, plug it in to access electricity, right? So we have the King Power Plant, which is right down the road from us. And that power plant is pretty much the reason that we have a Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in the entire United States, let alone for here on the St. Croix. When it was first proposed to build that power plant, a lot of people were very, very upset about it. A lot of people advocated against having it built in the first place. And in particular, former senator in Minnesota, known as Walter Mondale, and former senator in Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson, worked together, and they tried really hard to stop the plant from being built. Obviously, it's there. So obviously the plant got built. But part of what came out of this is that instead, a new federal legislation was passed, and it created a Wild and Scenic Rivers program, which is nationwide. And there was 7 rivers added to it, and the St. Croix was one of those first 7 to be added. So this was 1968 when that Wild and Scenic Rivers legislation was established. And for the part of it was Northern States Power at the time, now they're Xcel Energy. But for their part, they owned vast stretches of land along the Riverway up in like where Wild River State Park is now and Governor Knowles State Recreation Area. And a lot of that land they donated to the states, to Minnesota and Wisconsin, and to the National Park Service. So today, almost the entire stretch of the St. Croix River and the Namakagon are part of a national park. It's known as the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway, and they have a Park Service Visitor Center that you can go to up in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin, and they have a park superintendent, just like any other national park does. But what's cool about it being a being a wild and scenic river is that there's all these additional protections. So when you go out on the river, in almost anywhere other than the parts of the river down here that were already developed prior to 1968, almost any other stretch of the river, it looks like this, and it continues to look like this. Because part of the protections are that people can't cut down trees to be able to have, you know, a view of the river. And you can't build new roads and dams across the river. So this kind of protects this wild and scenic qualities that people enjoy when they go out on the water. And it helps to ensure that the river has stayed a lot cleaner than most other major river systems that we have. So it's really pretty special to have this like wild and scenic river that's so close to a major metropolitan area, because you can go out there and have this boundary waters like experience. What's cool too is if you've spent very much time up on the northern part of the watershed, and I will maybe just back up just to that map just so I can show you. like if you've spent much time up in this northern part of the watershed, there's all sorts of canoeing campsites and they're free. It's just first come, first serve canoeing campsites, just like what you would find in the boundary waters. So it's really accessible also. Yes, you have to plan ahead. Yes, you have to, be outdoorsy and have the right equipment, but, it's probably a lot easier to plan a trip on the St. Croix than some of the other national parks where you have to, book a year in advance to get your reservation to be able to get in. So the Namakagon River is the largest tributary on the St. Croix, and that's also protected by the Wild and Scenic Rivers legislation and also part of the national park. And this is where I thought I would pause just to give you a flavor for it. Sorry for the hop.
Here's what we did. We dropped off the bike at Whispering Pines Landing, and then we put in the canoe at County Road K. It's a 10-mile ride, and that took us a little over 5.5 hours. We stopped for a long lunch and also for a long swim along the way.
Day 2, we are getting on the river where we left off at Whispering Pines, and we're going to go down to McDowell Landing. Today's river is totally different than yesterday's. The water is smooth and flat everywhere we go, and then we found this little spring-fed stream. The water's super cold right where we're standing, and then as soon as you walk down to the river where Gary's standing, it's warm. It's pretty cool. Okay, so that was part of a much longer video I made when we did a 4-day trip. This was a COVID trip that me and my husband, son, and the dog, we spent 2 days on the Namakagon and 2 days on the St. Croix, and I brought along my mountain bike, and we just kind of did this leapfrog thing every day where I would drop off the bike where we were going to take out, and then we would float the canoe down, and I would get on the bike, and I would ride back and get the truck, and we would catch it up and just kind of leapfrogged our way down the river. But how many of you have gone to the Namakagon River? Ever spent any time there? I didn't know that a river could look like that. The first time I went there, and just the water being so crystal clear and being able to see all the fish swimming around underneath the boat and the beavers, and just, yeah, I was just blown away by the river. So this summer I went back there again, and here's, Charlie just kind of not glowering, he's looming over me, trying to look exaggeratingly tall. But yeah, we went back. It was a totally different experience this time too, because there's been so much rain this year, super high water level. So instead of lounging around and stopping on sandbars, it was just like, boom, down the river. No time for lollygagging. So that is, part of the story is the water in the river itself. But there is also a lot in the surrounding landscape that influences the St. Croix and is really also equally part of the story. So, okay, any guesses? Yep. So, here we go. I'll just put my pine cone necklace here as I prepare to speak for the trees. So, obviously, logging has had a really, really substantial impact on this watershed. And I think we all know that, like we've grown up learning about the history of logging in the area, but you sometimes don't stop to think pretty much all of the forests in Minnesota and Wisconsin were logged. Like any forest that you go in nowadays, you go in a forest and it looks like this, and it's beautiful and it's natural, and these are all second growth forests, which I think is, I feel both ways about. Like sometimes I feel sad, like, oh, we lost the old growth forest. And then other times I feel really reassured knowing that nature, if you give it the opportunity, will heal and come back and will be beautiful again in the future. And certainly in the St. Croix watershed, there are a lot of places where you can go and find these really beautiful forests. If you are into old growth, though, if you are into finding, little pockets of old growth forest, one place, Osprey Wilds Environmental Learning Center up in Sandstone, Minnesota, they are a place that's known for doing like educational programming, a lot of times where school groups will go and do sleepover kind of retreats, but they have some old growth white pine and red pine in their property. And it's also open to the public, and you can go hiking or you can go skiing during the winter time. Or if you go up by Namakagon Lake, there is, in Wisconsin, there's a place called Fairyland State Natural Area, and they have some old growth hemlock forest that's there as well. So, if you're into going and finding old forest, those are places that you could look. Okay, and so since I did write a book, I figured I might as well read a couple of things from it, right? And this is a good time to read about the forest and the woods. They say that trees can speak to each other in a language we humans are too busy to hear and too self-absorbed to understand. Peter Wohlben, a German forester who wrote the now famous book, The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, has learned that trees in a forest actually live as a community. They maintain interdependent relationships and share water and nutrients through underground fungal networks. They send distress signals about drought and disease through chemical, hormonal, and slow pulsing electrical signals, and can also communicate through the air by releasing pheromones and other scents. While traveling in New Zealand in 2016, my family and I visited the largest living quarry tree, a 2,000-year-old giant known locally as Tain Mahuta, Lord of the Forest. Can you imagine that? 2,000. Over the 2,000 years that Tain Mahuta has grown ever so slowly from a tiny seed into a behemoth tree 169 feet tall, the world has experienced the rise of Christianity, the fall of the Roman Empire, Western colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Australia, an industrial revolution, 2 world wars, and countless other changes. Does Tain Mahuta sense the enormity of change that has happened in its lifetime? Did it feel a mounting sense of loss as its community of quarry were slowly down for timber, as every year the chatter in the forest grew a little bit softer? I wonder too about solitary trees planted in city yards and rolling farm fields. Do they feel the same loneliness of modern society that plagues so many of us? Do they long for a community of their own with which to share signals and sustenance? Maybe the tree in your yard could use a couple of friends. So if you are interested in seeing different kinds of forests, the book does, share a couple of, recommendations for places to go, and knowing that forests are different in different parts of the watershed. So when we're down here in our area, you're going to be finding things that are, these kind of beautiful maple and aspen forests, or maybe oak savannas. And as you get further up into the watershed, that's when you are going to start finding those pine forests that some of us think of as, the real up north kind of forests. So forests, a very important part of the watershed. In the book, I also share some just kind of inspirational stories, and one comes to us from just a little ways south of here in the South Washington Watershed District, where they've been working with schools and taking turf out of commission and restoring it to native prairies and planting trees. So these kids, this is at Middleton Elementary in Woodbury. They actually planted 200 trees on their school property back in, I think this was 2017 when they planted these trees, and restored some prairie as well, and have been tending that ever since. And, just wrote about the experience of the kids getting to plant the trees and learning how to be keepers of the trees. All right. I think I might be down to my last prop. Oh, last prop. Okay. So one last part of there's so much more to the St. Croix, but one last part that I thought I would talk about with a prop, since I could just walk out to my front yard and, cut some down, is the role of prairies in the watershed, because We all know about the history of logging, and I think a lot of people incorrectly assume that Stillwater used to be a forest. And Stillwater was not a forest. The forests were further north of here. So in our area, in this lower part of the watershed, it was all, prairies and oak savannas and oak barrens. And there are even some places up in the watershed, like if you have gone to Crex Meadows, or the Namakagon Barrens, where they have a really unique kind of grassland known as a pine barrens, kind of like miniature pine trees growing in a prairie is the best way I could describe it. But one of the things about prairies that make them really unique is that while the grasses might be tall, their roots are even longer, right? Here, I need you to help me. So the roots, they could be, 5, 10, sometimes even 15 feet deep. Yeah, just these humongously deep root systems. And what that means is that prairies, they're very well adapted for the cold, but also for fire. So this is a fire-dependent ecosystem. And sometimes the fire happens naturally, but in a lot of cases, in where we have these like oak openings, it was maintained by people living here who were, intentionally setting fires to create openings where large game like elk or bison might come and be easier to hunt for them. So we have lost Minnesota at the time of European American settlement. They mapped all of the native vegetation, and about a third of the state was actually prairie. A third of Minnesota was prairie. And we've lost all but 2% of that. Yeah, so it's been just a very, very dramatic change in the landscape because the prairies were the areas that were easiest to farm. And then the farmland is the place that is the easiest to turn into housing or commercial development over time. So there are still pockets, though. Still pockets, like I said, where you can find either remnant prairies or restored prairies. And, kind of throughout the book and also in this section, I tried to highlight a few that are maybe very high quality, but not that user friendly. Versus ones that it's easy to go and visit, but maybe it's not as high quality. So, as an example, this Lost Valley Prairie Scientific Natural Area, this is down in Denmark Township. It's relatively easy to visit in that you can go and park there. It's not that far of a drive, but there's no trails, there's no bathroom, there's no maps or direction. And, if you take off going there and you're wearing shorts, you're going to be miserable. You're going to have a miserable experience. If you go to Afton State Park for, just up the road, it's not as high quality of prairie, but obviously, there's a campground and there's an interpretive center and there's trails and, all sorts of services. So, it's kind of a mix of things. But part of, what used to make prairies so unique was also just having these really large animals. And there are a couple of places where they have been able to reintroduce bison, which were almost driven to extinction. So Bellwin Conservancy in Afton, you can go in the beginning of the summer every year and they have a bison festival. They have about 1,500 acres of land and they've been restoring prairie and oak savanna since the late 70s. So now they have this festival every summer and they release bison out into the prairie off a stagecoach trail kind of by Lucy Winton Bell Fields. And they spend their summer there and then they round them up and they go back to a farm for the winter. They don't have quite enough land to sustain them year round. So that's one place and a very fun experience to go and see the bison get released. And then another place that you might not be as familiar with, Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve. This is in East Bethel. And it's another location. They actually keep the bison there year round. And there is a public walking trail, Fish Creek Nature Trail. And when you get to the end of it, there's a little observation platform where you can maybe could see bison. I've never yet seen the bison when I go there. What I did find was a skink. And did you know that there are lizards that live in Minnesota? There's 3 species of lizards. So there is a northern prairie skink, a 5-lined skink, and a 6-lined race runner. So we found this skink in the outhouse of all places. It was the first skink I've ever found in the wild. I knew they existed, but I never thought to look for them in the outhouse. And then just, my favorite place, and this is a place that I have gone to just time and time and time again, and especially during COVID, Standing Cedars Community Land Conservancy is just right on the other side of the river, south of Osceola. They have 4 parcels, and the parcels are non-contiguous. They aren't attached to each other, but you can go to the Inglewood track, and one benefit that I love about it is you can have dogs off leash as long as it's not bird nesting season. So you can go there, and this is the only one that you can actually get your way down to the St. Croix River. You really have to be persistent about it. But the buffalo skull, if you go there, they have this beautiful little remnant prairie that they've been working on restoring and expanding. And there's also just this gorgeous spring-fed stream and really cool rocks and geology, and what we like to call the secret waterfall. So my son and I during COVID, and the dog, can't leave Molly out. She's like the secret star of the book. But we would just go there and spend the whole day. Sometimes during COVID, we would just bring a hammock and we'd string it up, and we'd bring books. And honestly, even during the winter, it's like if you wear snow pants, it's fine. We'd be fine. We'd be warm enough. Okay, so as much as the river is important and the woods are important and the prairie is important, we also love our lakes, and we've got a lot of really great lakes to explore. And there's no possible way that I could choose, the 10 best, but, did list a couple that I think are special for different reasons, either because they're close and clean and easy to recreate on, or, in the case of Chisago Lakes, there's this Chisago Lakes water trail that you could, theoretically spend the whole day canoeing around and going from one lake to the next. So just some, really, really fun lake experiences. In Quest to the Perfect Supper Club. Yes, so one of the things that was most fun for me in writing this book is that I had all of these places that I had some experience with, and then I had this running list of places that I'd never gone before. And then I got to this point where I was like, oh, well, now I've just got to start going. And so, every weekend I'd be like, okay, what's the, which one am I going to knock off this weekend, and how am I going to fit it all in? And there was one Friday night when our son was at camp, and my husband and I were just like, what are we going to do with ourselves? And I'm like, oh, there's still so many places I have to go and visit. And as I'm talking, he's like on his phone, and I'm thinking he's just not listening to me. But in actuality, what he was doing was looking up the Balsam Lake Lodge. He said, it turns out there's a supper club on Balsam Lake. Didn't you say you wanted to go to Balsam Lake? So it's a beautiful Friday night. The sun is setting, and we hopped in the car, and it was just shy of an hour to get there from Stillwater, 55 minutes. So I feel like that's safely within the going for a drive zone. So we drove up there, and just had this beautiful experience. It was cheese curds, there was beer, there was a bachelorette party wearing cowgirl hats, shots of paradise. It was everything. And I think that that's so much of what it is that we love about nature in this area, that it's not always just wild and untouched. We also have this really personal relationship where we get to enjoy having an evening on the water and on the lake, and really get to, be with the water, be with the river, be with the lakes. I'm also really proud of the way that people in our local communities have been caring for and restoring our waterways. And those of you who live in Stillwater probably know about Lily Lake and the efforts that it took to get that lake restored and taken off of the impaired waters list. It was 2002 when it was added to the impaired waters list, 2022 when it was delisted. And a lot of hard work that went on in the interim from the Lake Association and the city and community residents and the Middle St. Croix Watershed Management Organization, the Washington Conservation District, tons of state money, so much went in to cleaning up this lake. But this was from our delisting celebration that we had in fall of 2022. Matt Downing, who's the administrator for the Middle St. Croix WMO, these are his daughters. And what we are doing is we are ceremonially burning the impairment listing. We're like, haha, we did it. So it was really fun because Mike Leiner, who is on the Lake Association, he kind of came over with this torch riding on a paddle boat, like the kind that you paddle with your feet, and then, pass the torch to the next generation. And yeah, it was just this really, kind of silly, but also very sweet experience. This summer, another lake, and I shouldn't, these are not the only lakes that have come off of the impaired waters list, but this summer, another one in Washington County, Bone Lake, is another one that I've, been involved with the people on that lake for quite some time. Tom Fury is a water steward volunteer, has been since 2017. He's really actively engaged in the Lake Association, and I feel like he's done a lot of work towards getting that lake water quality, to be improved, but also just all of those other partners in the area. We actually nominated him as our Conservation Cooperator of the Year this year for the Washington Conservation District. So it's just been fun getting to know all these people. And, so many people have contributed in so many ways, whether it's yes, planting rain gardens, or taking care of the rain gardens, or just planting native plants, or stenciling storm drains, or adopting a drain. We have, I think, 23,000 people in the state of Minnesota that have adopted storm drains to help reduce stormwater pollution, which I know that's a lot. I feel like, and it's not a very like sexy, fun thing to do. You're just like cleaning up schmuck so it doesn't go down the storm drain. But so on and so forth. So the book, I don't want to like go on and talk forever, but there's beautiful places to explore. There's waterfalls to be seen. There are some pretty cool stream restoration stories in our area as well. Two that you might be most familiar with. One is Trout Brook that goes through Afton Alps and Afton State Park. And they it was historically ditched. And despite having the name Trout Brook, it didn't have trout in it anymore. So the South Washington Watershed District has been working on re-meandering this stream, restoring the natural floodplain and habitat. There are now, according to fish surveys, thousands of trout in the stream. And they are going to be having a celebration on October 9th, kind of a celebratory event to commemorate this final stretch of, stream restoration that's been happening there. A little closer to Stillwater, you have undoubtedly, if you've gone out on the Browns Creek Trail, noticed that there's a lot going on there too. So very similar kind of work happening where the Browns Creek Watershed District is taking a stretch that was historically straightened and is re-meandering it, because streams naturally like to wiggle, and giving it back that natural floodplain, getting the invasive buckthorn out of there, and in the long term creating a lot better habitat for trout and other fish. I know. So wetlands, you would never hear somebody say, you really got to go see that wetland. It's not like one of those destinations, but it is a really important part of the watershed. So I did highlight a couple of places where you can see different unique types of watersheds or types of wetlands. But I think what my favorite experience in writing this book was getting to go wild racing for my first time. Anybody ever done that? Anybody? You have? Okay. Yeah, it was one of those things that I've always thought, wouldn't that be cool to do? And one of the fun things about making videos for like Instagram and TikTok is that I have gotten to meet virtually a lot of people from other places around the state, even around the country, that I don't think I would have otherwise. And so this young man, Guy Waden, he reached out to me just kind of out of the blue, like we'd never met each other. But he sent me a message and he said, Angie, would you like to come wild racing with us? And I was like, yes, obviously. So it was fall of 2022. And, I spent a day that I went up and met them. It was a group of people affiliated with the Water Protectors and led by Ojibwe people who were, kind of demonstrating the traditional ways of harvesting wild rice. And it was just such an experience from beginning to end. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were talking about doing things with Native people and how time moves at a different pace than it does in white culture. And if anybody ever has done, you might have experienced that with other, other cultures. Americans were very, very, very fast. This was a day that unfolded very slowly. It was like we met and we were sitting in a circle, and everybody went around the circle. And there's people from all around the world. I was so surprised. There was people from Senegal and South Africa and all these different places who had come because they wanted to meet Native people in Minnesota, and they wanted to learn more about, the water issues here and the wild racing. But it was like we sat in a circle and everybody introduced themselves, and not like the short version. Everybody introduced themselves like the whole, like, here's who I am and my life story and how I relate to the water. So it took 3 hours, for us to go around the circle, which to, I think, a lot of Americans is like, oh my gosh, why are we wasting so much time? But to them, that is the purpose. Like the purpose was to connect and have a relationship with one another and the resource. And even when we were going out wild racing, Gawaden was teaching us, and he's like, well, you use these sticks and you're bopping the seeds and they're falling into the canoe. And a lot of them don't fall in the canoe. A lot of them fall other places. And you might think, oh no, I'm doing such a bad job, but the wild rice is an annual plant. And so it's important that some of the seeds fall in the water instead of into your boat, because otherwise there's not going to be wild rice next year. And otherwise there's not going to be wild rice for the birds and, for the spiders and the insects and everything else that needs wild rice. So it was a really special day, and I loved that. There's really cool geology. There's outdoor recreation throughout the year. Even if it's the middle of the winter, there are fun things to do in the St. Croix watershed. And, like I said, just tried to highlight some nice conservation stories of people, whether they're private landowners restoring prairie, restoring wetlands on their property, just all the really cool things that are happening in the watershed. So then I figured, this is who was just telling me that you were saying that you are, because she goes to the church across the street from my house and so sees that view a lot. I figured I would end with a stewardship story, lessons from a garden. Sometimes you think you have a really good idea, like planting vegetable gardens at your office. Full of enthusiasm, you put your family to work and spend an entire day tearing out sod, piecing together scrap lumber, and hauling in dirt. It's hard work, but you feel proud. Then it's the next year. You think it will be easier, but it's not. This time, it's only you, your kid, and the dog. Last year's dirt is rock hard and full of weeds. You dig, you hammer, you sweat. There's a truck full of new soil to unload and only a 6-year-old to help. But he does. He rakes the rich black dirt smooth while you shovel and haul one wheelbarrow after another. Shovel, haul, shovel. Finally, it's time to plant, and that part, the long-awaited planting, is finished so surprisingly quickly. By then, the sun is set, you're covered in dirt, and the dog has ticks. But at last, the garden is planted. You can learn many lessons from a garden. One is that few things worth doing in life happen easily or quickly. Whether you're training for a race, raising a child, or trying to restore the St. Croix River, it can take months, years, or even a lifetime of hard work and relentless forward motion to succeed. In the example of a race, there's at least an endpoint at which your work is done and the long-sought goal accomplished. Like most other things in life, however, the garden is never finished. The garden is an endless cycle of hoeing and planting, weeding and tending, preserving before the winter and then starting over in the spring. Planting seeds and harvesting tomatoes are the shortest, sweetest tasks in a never-ending, though worthwhile and satisfying job. Gardening also shows us how hard it is to transform the earth from one thing into another. In the still of the night, while the freshly raked soil lies smooth and brown, the weeds have already begun to creep in and take over. Maple seed helicopters spiral to the ground, ready to reclaim the garden as a forest. As the summer progresses, the edging cracks and the hand-painted markers fade. To preserve the garden requires constant tending. Even when we aim to turn the process in reverse, Changing farm field back to prairie or restoring a degraded lake, nature seems to fight the transformation. The larger the garden, the harder the job becomes. The St. Croix River Basin is 7,760 square miles. That's nearly 5 million acres of land to tend. Today, the gardeners work hoeing and weeding, planting and tending. They plant rain gardens in cities and buffers on stream banks and farm fields. They patch crumbling ravines to keep sediment and nutrients out of the river and convert perennial crops to pasture land. As in gardening, the work is never ending, though worthwhile and rewarding. The garden teaches us two final lessons. The first is that many hands make the workload lighter. One person can plant a garden, though it is hard and bitter work. But one person can't restore a river, and neither can one agency or one organization. Finally, the garden urges us to teach and involve our youth. Those kids will amaze you with what they can already do. Planting trees, weeding rain gardens, stenciling storm drains, and planning events. They burst in with new ideas and enthusiasm, ready to help us tend the garden, not just in the future, but also today. If you show them, they'll learn how to sow the seeds and nurture the plants. Equally important, the garden will teach you how to trust children and hand them a rake and a shovel. So, I am done talking and happy to answer questions. Yeah.